Marshall and Saagar here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey, everybody. Hey, YouTube specifically. Really excited to have video intros back up. Our producer, Phil Hegseth, is slowly coming back to work full time on the show again. We're very excited about that. And you will all be excited at the improved quality on the show and the thing everyone has been asking for, which is intro music once again. Hope you just enjoyed that. Today's episode is an interview continuing our Ukraine coverage, where Saagar and I spoke with Christian Brose. He's currently the Chief Strategy Officer at Anduril Industries, a technology startup that focuses on national defense capabilities. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace and was, most importantly, a staff director at the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, where he was the youngest person to ever hold the position in the committee's history. We are interested in the topic of the U.S. military, and given how the Russian military is performing in Ukraine, how does the U.S. military stack up? How does it stack up to Russia? How does it stack up to China? Christian has recently released a book, which is now in paperback. It's called The Kill Chain: Defending America and the Future of High-Tech Warfare. So we are going to get into that topic, U.S. performance, China, Russia, all that stuff. Hope you enjoy this episode. Chris Brose, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to see you, Chris.
Likewise.
So we'll get to The Kill Chain, your book, which is just coming out in paperback. Very great timing. This will be released the day of this episode coming out, Tuesday, the 15th of March. But The Kill Chain is focused on the U.S. military in ways that it is or isn't up to 21st century conflict. But let's start with Russia. Interesting idea. The book is mostly focused on China. Russia fits in this well too. We'll get to China, but I've just been struck by Russia's military performance the past few weeks. How would you assess that performance, and how does that fit into your matrix of whether or not the U.S. is ready to compete with peer militaries?
Yeah. So it's it's always kind of difficult to kind of watch this and really get a good assessment of what's actually happening on the ground. We're sitting here outside of government, sort of viewing it from 30,000 feet. But I guess would sort of fit myself into the conventional wisdom here of at least initially being sort of surprised at the degree to which Russia appears to be underperforming. And I think there's very clear reasons for that. In terms of not committing perhaps, as much force up front as they, might have assumed to, or we might have assumed to. I think holding back on certain tactics, wanting to win hearts and minds, while they're invading Ukraine.
Good luck with that.
But, I think the other piece of this here is kind of like, we're all very tempted to sort of like, grade the homework on a 24-hour news cycle or a, 140 character cycle. And, this is still got a lot of time to play out. And I think, unfortunately, as Putin becomes more of the caged animal, as the military is not doing as well as it would like, I think he's going to resort to more and more brutal tactics, which we've already seen in terms of, more of the Chechnya, Syria playbook and being much more indiscriminate, much more kind of gloves off in his approach to his military campaign. Which may, kind of brutally succeed or just like catastrophically backfire. And I think, for the US and NATO and Europe and the world, we need to do everything in our power to make sure it's the latter. To your point about, kind of how should we think about the US in this context, right? I mean, it's difficult to draw a lot of similarities, right? I mean, a, Russian land invasion into Europe, vice, kind of the types of challenges that the US has been thinking through. I guess like the thing that I would really underscore about it, and it's somewhat of a theme of the book, is that, as you look at the ways technology is changing, kind of the proliferation of, kind of drones and intelligence and precision warfare and the like, you could make an argument about it, but my argument would be that it's a lot harder today to be the offense and it's somewhat easier to be the defense. So long as you make the right changes, you make the right choices, you're going to buy the right capabilities, you exercise them, know how to use them and integrate them together. And, I think what the Ukrainians have been sort of, in my opinion, thankfully, hopefully, kind of excitedly, doing rather well is employing these kind of counter power projection capabilities to really good effect. starting to use, Turkish UAS, precision strike, anti-tank, anti-aircraft weapons, to really counter the sort of more traditional systems that Russia has been bringing into the theater, ground combat vehicles, aircraft, helicopter gunships, and the like. So, I think if there's sort of lessons in learning to be involved here, it's that if you make the right kinds of investments, if you kind of bring some of these new technologies to bear, you can defend yourself pretty robustly. You can make it very difficult for an adversary that's seeking to engage in acts of violence, power projection, offense, to really have a hard go of it, right? So if we kind of shift our focus to Indo-PACOM, right? Like my hope would be that the lessons that, say, the Taiwanese are taking from this is we should buy a lot less tanks and sort of big diesel submarines and sort of traditional instruments or platforms of warfare, and just start arming ourselves to the teeth with, proliferated sensors and precision strike weapons and anti-ship cruise missiles and anti-aircraft weapons, because it can really just kind of create a hell of a challenge for an aggressor in that type of a context. And I think the broader lesson for the United States is we're thinking about sort of the deterrence and kind of ultimate, God forbid, having to win at this type of conflict. I don't think the U.S. is going to go looking to start the war with Russia, with China, but in the event that we have to respond, if God forbid the conflict in Ukraine spills into NATO or a broader European conflict, many of the things that are going to be most valuable for the United States in creating real predicaments for a peer adversary, a near peer adversary, ultimately grinding that down and being successful are going to be the sort of lower cost, types of systems that the Ukrainians are using, less the sort of big instruments of power projection that we've traditionally spent most of our defense budget on. And it just leads you to a lot of different choices about the way you build your force, what you invest in, the future technologies that are most relevant, and how you think about allies and partners, which, is kind of the big, underwriting or overarching theme of my book. And, I think there's a lot to be learned here, but I would just, kind of say again what I said at the beginning, like this is far from over. And, I'm sort of reluctant to draw lessons in
right.
the middle of the conflict.
I think that's very smart. We've generally been reiterating a lot of the same. I guess one thing I'm curious is how do we balance both the need for, so for example, like I went to the Georgetown security studies program. I spent a lot of time with some of the people who were thinking about this on a conceptual level, and everything was the future of warfare. You're not even going to recognize it. It's going to be cyber. It's going to be technology. And then a war actually broke out in Europe, and it looks extraordinarily conventional, Chris. And actually, I was just reading the losses are conventional. The equipment seems very conventional. All of the, predictions of precision warfare and all that. Yeah, I mean, we've had cruise missiles, though, for a long time. It doesn't seem all of that next generation. So then in terms of, first of all, can you just respond to kind of what that means relative to our discourse in the way that the future of war that was sold to us, and then what war actually is, and then what that means also for the likelihood of, if the U.S. is to get into a conflict, is it going to look like a Vietnam, like in Iraq and in Afghanistan? Or is that prophecy of, Saagar, you don't even understand the high-tech warfare that is to come? Is that actually going to happen this time? Because I'm just a little bit skeptical right now.
Yeah, no, so it's a great point. It's a great observation. And I guess my put on it would be, this is the world of 2022. I think the challenge for all of us is thinking through, and oh, by the way, like none of this just started in January, right? I mean, this is a continuum that we're on, has been playing out for a while, will continue to play out. So I think the question is sort of where are we on that continuum and where are we going? Mm-hmm. So if I were to step back and sort of speak in historical analogies, right? When we talk about the onset of World War I, 1914, and sort of all of what people looked at the time as this sort of transformation of warfare in terms of precision artillery, machine guns, aircraft, those kinds of next generation capabilities. All of those were visible in some form or another, dating all the way back in some form to the American Civil War.
Yeah, that's right.
And then running through the conflicts of Europe, wars of German unification, the Boer War, those kinds of conflicts where you saw versions of this playing out, and then all of a sudden we saw it in high relief in August of 1914, and the years that followed. I would say sort of similarly, if we kind of look back, there's a lot of what has been visible in Ukraine that has been visible in Ukraine, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, in Georgia in 2008, and it's this sort of continuum that we're on. And then you kind of think about, well, where are we going in that respect? But to kind of focus it on the here and now, I think the things to call out that are concerning or should be concerning for us, right, is how challenging it is to evade detection, right? The Russians are trying to move in, and they are viewed at all times by, people with sensors on their bodies posting to social media, overhead imagery, commercial satellite, all of this, kind of means, to say nothing of the just actual military sensors that the Ukrainians have deployed, UAS and other things, makes it very difficult to hide. And then you couple that with, increasingly precise means of, fires and effects, low cost weapons. Once found, it becomes very difficult to survive. And then when you sort of think about, well, where are we going in that regard, where you take, the proliferation of sensors, the proliferation of fires, and the ability to network them together, and automate and accelerate, that sort of kill chain process, from finding to fixing, targeting, tracking, engaging, acting, through things like artificial intelligence, machine learning. The challenge begins to scale very quickly, right? In terms of the number of systems that are on the battlefield, the speed with which it enables human decision-making, or in some cases, machine decision-making, and just the volume of it becomes very overwhelming. So, I think where we are in a snapshot of time is that, you can see the continuum, right? You can see reflections of Nagorno-Karabakh last year in what Russia and Ukraine are engaged in this year. You can see.
Chris, could you contextualize that for a second?
Yeah, sorry, apologies. So, last year, Armenia and Azerbaijan got into a conflict. I won't explain the origins of it. But what you saw was, one side, the Azeris using, low-cost unmanned aerial systems for target identification, target tracking, linked to very precise weaponry, whether it's rocket artillery or missiles being fired from drones, other kind of means. And what that just, enabled them to do was wreak havoc on Armenian forces, because they just couldn't hide. And once they were found, they had a very limited of time to get out of the way before they were struck. And it just became, a very challenging situation operationally for them to contend with, because of the way that the Azeris had brought, kind of low-cost technology, unmanned technology, kind of AI-enabled weapons and things of that sort to bear, to just rapidly accelerate the means by which they could find and act against Armenian forces. And I think you're seeing a version of that now in Ukraine. And I would say that it's sort of nothing like where I think this trend is going to go in the future. So, to come back to your question, I don't think we're anywhere close to what these technologies and how people will start thinking about employing them operationally is going to deliver us in terms of future warfare. But I think, God forbid, if you sort of, if future warfare breaks out in 2025 or 2028 or 2033, we'll look back and see this continuum of events that makes sense in retrospect, in the same way that it did in the aftermath of World War I. And I think the challenge for us now is to learn the lessons of where all of these technologies, admittedly in their infancy, are being fielded and used now, so that we can get ahead of this problem and not find ourselves, sort of quote unquote surprised, the way that many perhaps might have been surprised in 1914 if they otherwise hadn't been paying attention.
And I want to zoom in on an idea that is undergirding your talk, especially when you're comparing the Civil War to the Franco-Prussian War, the Boer War, and then World War I, because you made this point at the start of the episode that there could be an advantage to the defense. And if you're looking at previous wars, miscalculating where that goes is a huge problem. So, for example, running into World War I, the popular perception was offense had the advantage, when actually during the style of warfare it turned into. Entrenched warfare, the defense with machine guns, all sorts of tactics, actually had the offensive as you spent 3 years just throwing millions and millions of people away under that idea. So can you just speak to this like actual need to understand whether offense or defense has an advantage, and why specifically in this case, defense isn't, this doesn't mean you're always going to win. The Germans lost World War I eventually, but what are the factors that play into the current and future battlefield when we're making this calculation?
Yeah. So I would first of all, again, start out by saying, intelligent and informed and experienced people are going to disagree on this, right? I mean, there's arguments on both sides. And the other thing I would say to preface it is that it's constantly changing, right? So I think the lesson of 1914 to 1918 was fires had developed to such an extent in terms of volume and precision of, machine guns, artillery, things like that. But tactics in terms of maneuver were largely unchanged from like Greco-Roman times. Like it was dudes walking across the ground. And in a volley of machine gun fire, like that's a really bad place to be. Like defense is going to win every time. And literally they had to go underground to survive. So fast forward 20 years later, and now you have, in 1920s, 1930s, innovations in cars, mechanized vehicles, armor, and all of a sudden, tanks, which, had been sort of an interesting idea, have now become a centerpiece of warfare. The Germans are able to integrate this together with airplanes, which have also become like a real thing, and fires and communications. And then you have blitzkrieg. And being the defender sitting in a trench is like a really bad place to be when you're being run over by this offensive juggernaut. So, to answer your question, it comes back to the, sort of age-old military kind of doctrine of, shoot, move, communicate. And, how the offense or the defense is going to end up advantaged or disadvantaged comes down to the balance of shooting, maneuvering, and communicating. And technology drives all of those things, right? The ability to maneuver, the ability to fire, the ability to communicate, access to information. And as those technologies are blended together, brought together, you end up having advantages, right? So in 1914, maneuver was largely unchanged, over the history of warfare, right? It's like horses and people. 20 years later, you now have a completely different means of maneuvering that creates an advantage for the offense. So as I look at the situation today, I think the sort of trend of technology that we've been engaged in now for decades has to do with proliferation of sensors, proliferation of lower cost precision strike warfare, missiles, fires, weapons, which has created, kind of a variation of what we saw in 1914, where it becomes harder, not impossible, but harder to project power when, the means of being detected, the means of then being, struck once found, are lower cost. The barriers of entry are lower. The volumes of capability that can be fielded are much higher. So, I think that's kind of where we are on this continuum. So I would still say net, the defender has an advantage, right? We talk about the sort of Taiwan scenario as, increasingly hopeless. And like, I'm not here to say that it's like, like a rosy situation, but 100+ miles of open water to an amphibious landing, in the teeth of the right kind of military capabilities, that's a nasty problem, right? I mean, the only thing harder than defending against an amphibious invasion is engaging in one. The right kinds of choices really would advantage the defender here, but technology doesn't stop, and it's entirely possible, right, that in a few years, 5 years, 10, 15, whatever years, you've now kind of flipped this equation once again on its head to an advantage where the offense really has, an ability to move, shoot, and communicate, and put this all together in a way that is very difficult to defend against.
And what I will say to that amphibious point, I think this is a takeaway we can make. Paratroopers, now that this is the tactic they would use, paratroopers are not looking particularly great as a tactic in the Ukraine conflict right now. So,
yeah, and I mean, I think if our strategy rests on the ability to fly, kind of totally observable aircraft very close to an objective and like drop a bunch of people and equipment, onto the X, odds are that aircraft's probably not going to get too close to where it needs to go. These are the kinds of challenges that I think you see the Russians contending with. And there's a lot of other factors that explain why they haven't done as well as some had predicted. But, I think at a higher level, this is one of them.
I want to get to the central idea of the book because, and Chris, this is a real serious compliment. We do a lot of books here. Yours is the first book where I listened to the intro on Audible, and I stopped it and I re-listened to it again because it's just really shocking the way you set up and framed it. So if you want to preview a bit, I'd love for you to talk about, so you're focusing on war gaming and how indications are as of 2020. I guess the book's coming out again. So as of 22, you still endorse this underlying idea. Obviously, indications are from experts that the US is not equipped for the style of warfare that we could see ourselves engaged with in specifically, let's say, the Indo-Pacific. Could you just give some recounting of what these studies indicate and why the intro is just so dire? It's a real, that's why we listened to it again, because it's just not what you're really set up to expect, given, the quick editorial out here is, look, like Iraq and Afghanistan, our expectation is maybe we don't do the post-war part great, but we're good to go during the actual war part. Hearing the way you described it was just really shocking. So please just go into that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate that. It's, I appreciate the compliment. So the central kind of, or the opening kind of idea of the book is, if you do look back, and this, has become public knowledge, but we have a bad track record of losing war games. And look, there will be some who will say, like, the purpose of war games is to lose war games. Like, that's how you learn. And truth. However, like, you can lose for the right reasons and you can lose for the wrong reasons. And, I'd just echo comments that General Hyten, when he was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, made around the concerning kind of conclusions of this. And I guess the broader point to make, stepping back, is, the sort of central assumptions under which we have built the United States military are being called into question by the way that China is modernizing and building up its own military. The central assumptions that we have made, going right back to your comment about, Iraq and Gulf War, is if something happens, even if it is, an action initiated by an adversary, we will have a long period of time to sort of, set the theater, move an enormous amount of military capability and people halfway around the world logistically into position, build that capability up in forward bases, forward infrastructure. And then the war will start at a time of our choosing, and we will have technological overmatch. We'll be able to penetrate, deep into the territory of an adversary, at least not for very long. They won't have an ability to really contest that to a great extent. And many of the things that, we rely upon to fight the way that we fight, access to logistics and basing and outer space and information, command and control, the electromagnetic spectrum, we've assumed will always be there for us. They'll be like, the air we breathe. They're critical enablers, but we just take them for granted because nobody has ever really had much of an ability to take them away from us. And really the thing that is most concerning is not just that, China's been building up, effective military capabilities. It's the way in which they have been modernizing. And they're building up a military somewhat different from ours, in that they are specifically focused on calling into question and holding at risk all of those underlying capabilities that the United States military has used for a very long time to project power across the world, to fight the way that we have traditionally planned to fight. And you can boil it down, and I'll be somewhat sort of reductionist about it, right? We have a military that's built around a relatively small number of really big, expensive, exquisite, heavily manned, hard to replace things, right? Vehicles, ships, aircraft, satellites. And China has been building up a military, to a lesser extent Russia, to hold all of those things at risk, to call them all into question, to find them, to strike them, to grind down the movement of our force logistically, to deny us access to information, to shoot satellites out of orbit, to target our logistics forces, things that we just hadn't expected would be the case. So when you kind of ask the so what about that and roll that into a war game, it doesn't work well because we are being disrupted. And it's a very hard thing, I think, for people to kind of get their head around, is that we have been put into the disruptor's dilemma, where the very things that we are doing, if we continue to do them, will be, kind of the means of our unmaking. If we keep doing the same things in the same way with the same things, that is exactly what our competitors want us to do, right? Like Netflix wanted Blockbuster to open more brick and mortar stores, right? Like this is not the way that we need to go about this. So, to me, I think the most concerning thing here is, we do war games, we do tabletop exercises, we analyze our decisions so that we can make better decisions about what we buy, how we invest in technology, how we train people, how we think about operations. So we don't have to learn that lesson the hard way. And this is the tricky thing about the military, is that, in pretty much every other walk of life, you have a means of feedback from the market or from competitors. Businesses can figure out quite quickly whether they're doing well or doing badly. They have feedback. Militaries don't. So they have to kind of find the best way to model it as best they can. So things like war games, while imperfect, are nonetheless important sources of feedback. And, what I would say, and what I do say in the beginning of the book, is that, for the past however many years, that has been blinking red. And, we are finally starting to change, but we are way behind the curve in terms of the changes we need to make. And I would argue we're still not positioned to, and still not doing enough of the things that we need to be doing to get out ahead of this problem, not get caught, not get surpassed by a disruptive kind of peer competitor that is doing a lot of the right things to call at risk and hold at risk everything that we have been building in terms of our military capability and the ways that we've been thinking about using it. And the final thing, I know it's a long answer, I apologize. The final thing I'd say here is that we focus a lot on technology, we focus a lot on operations. But the thing I try to get across in the book, and what I would underscore here, is that this is ultimately about this is change that has to occur at the level of ideas. This is about the way we think about this problem. And like Moneyball was not a book about baseball, right? It was a book about disruption. It was a book about changing thinking. And I think that is what's needed now. It is a change in thinking about the nature of the problem we're facing, and a totally different approach to the sets of solutions that have to get fielded for us to be successful. We are not going to do kind of better versions of old things and get out of this predicament. We have to do totally different things. We have to field totally different solutions if we want to be successful.
So Chris, let's then diagnose. So we've given a good problem. You're a smart guy. You even ran the Senate Armed Services Committee for a time. Then what are the biggest structural barriers to making the changes that you see necessary? Yeah. If we look then at the history of warfare and the history of innovation, this is almost always the case, right? Which is that you have like a moribund military with aged leadership, aged tactics that gets confronted by a scrappy defensive adversary, which causes everybody to freak out. And it takes like 2 or 3 years, and unfortunately a lot of bloodshed in order to eventually arrive to the correct situation. Ideally, we skip that part. So what are the main barriers in our thinking institutionally right now? Because I'm going to read between the lines and say that there's a lot of congressional problems as to why some of the best things aren't happening.
Congress can be part of the problem, but I think a lot of people are too quick to kind of lay all the blame at Congress, and I'll get back to that. But to your question, which is a really good and serious question, I think it's sort of it's in our interest to kind of acknowledge up front. One, yes. Change in military institutions is hard because they tend to be culturally traditional in a way that is hard to change. And that's not for bad reasons.
Yeah.
I think the wrong kind of change, in the commercial world, it's like, like we'll get over it. We'll survive. Like my kid might be disconnected from, his iPad for an hour, but it'll be okay. The wrong kind of change in national defense and the military leads to loss of life, leads to loss of innocent life. So it breeds a reticence to change. Again, not for all the wrong reasons. I think the other part of this is like, it behooves us to recognize that this is hard. From the standpoint of the disruptor's dilemma, like we are being disrupted. It is very kind of cognitively difficult, I think, for an institution, particularly one like the United States that has been top of the heap, laps in front of the competition for a generation now, to sort of accept the idea that the very things that have delivered me this historic level of success, if I keep doing them, they're going to deliver me failure. At a human level, it's hard to understand, right? It's like, this is the system that has enabled me to be successful. It can't be wrong. Like there's a desire to sort of trust that system and trust that process, even when it is leading to the wrong solution. So again, disruption is difficult. Disruption in industry is hard. Responding to disruption is hard. I think the bigger problem, there's a lot of reasons for it, but I'd say to kind of like hone in on the biggest one is that there are not incentives for disruption in national defense. There are there are incentives for disruptions in everything else that we do, right? I mean, if Uber is better than taxi cabs, I will use Uber. If Spotify is better than like that big CD wallet that I used to lug around, I'm going to subscribe. That doesn't exist in national defense. We have created a system where the entire way that the institution engages with and thinks about and accesses technology is antiquated. We have a system of thinking through, how do we define requirements for the solution? How do we set up a program and a budget to acquire it? How do we put a strategy together to go procure it? How do we seek authorization and appropriations from Congress to fund it? If you take that thing from end to end, that's like a decade-long cycle. Mm-hmm. And each one of those pieces is run by a totally different part of the institution, or in some cases, branch of government. So you have a fracturing of accountability for delivering disruption across the United States government. It's slow, it's elongated, and it makes it very difficult to respond quickly and to respond at all effectively, especially when the threat and technology are changing quick. This kind of worked in the Cold War, right? When we were building ICBMs and aircraft carriers and things that very few companies in America were going to build. They were going to be built on very long cycles, entirely based off of government investment. And then once bought, we were going to keep them for decades. That's just not the world we live in anymore. That is not the nature of technology. And that's not what is going to be successful in terms of defining future military capability. So to your point about Congress, Congress can be part of the problem. They, for very political and sort of partisan reasons, can be resistant to change, can force the department to keep doing things that, maybe we shouldn't be doing, or buying things that we shouldn't be buying. The challenge is not just kind of, throwing our hands up about it. It's understanding the political logic that leads them to do that. And coming up with a better solution. And I think a lot of the problem is not that Congress is resistant to change, and even in my experience, and I think it's only become the case, since I've left the government, 3.5 years ago, members of Congress who I talk to every day are dying for change. They want to change. They realize that we are in a bad spot. I think part of the problem is that oftentimes the position that the Congress gets put in is the Department of Defense comes up to them and says, there's this particular military system that, is built in your district, is based in your state, has lots of your constituents involved in jobs and, kind of operations. And we want to kill it this year. And this like long process by which we think about and program for and acquire technology is going to generate a replacement to this thing that we want to kill this year in 7 years or possibly never. And Congress isn't stupid. They've seen this movie before, and they end up kind of getting into a position of saying, you can take away the thing that I value today when you deliver me the tool that I will use tomorrow, which isn't unfair. It's not politically insane to think that, right? The problem is not that Congress wants to lock the department in the past. It's the problem that the future never shows up. So we're always waiting for, what is that next great thing that's going to replace, the fourth generation fighter jets and this, that, or the other capability that, many people in the United States care about for very understandable reasons. And if we can't increase the velocity by which we are fielding military capability, the right kind of military capability, we should not be surprised that members of Congress and members of the military and large segment of traditional defense industry are going to want to keep plowing money and investment into buying the things that we have today. And that's the problem that we have, I think, is an inability to change fast enough and get to scale, disruptive things, new things. We end up just stuck with the same old seed corn.
Speak up for audience skepticism, not of you necessarily, but just the broader construct here. We spend so much money on our defense budget, just from a pure comparison to even the peer competitors we're talking about. So skeptical audience members are basically just saying, look, Chris, if we're spending this much money and we're getting these poor results, they're going to be skeptical that this system, and once again, you refer to this, you and Senator McCain would talk about the military industrial congressional complex. They are just deeply skeptical of the structure of this system, whether or not it's focused on platforms, whether or not it's focused on this kill chain strategy. So could you just speak to this idea of skepticism, given the amount of resources at a dollar amount that's poured in?
Yeah, I mean, my short answer is count me in. I'm part of the skeptics. I lived in this world in government. I'm now living in this world, inside of, a non-traditional defense company, technology company. I could steal the rest of your show explaining all the reasons I'm skeptical. I guess the main thing I would
Can I say one quick thing to modify then? Agreed. That's why you have credibility. I mean, this is why you have credibility on this issue. The second you said that term, I was like, okay, we're good to go here.
Yeah, I mean,
it's more just the skepticism comes from just the construct.
Totally.
So that's more what I mean.
Yeah, no, and I get that. I just wanted to be very clear that kind of where I'm coming from on this. I mean, the thing that I would say, and I think the reason this is a bigger challenge, is that it's of course about the money, but it's not about the money. The issue right now is not that, the premise of a lot of the discussion in Washington is we are doing most of the right things and we just need to spend a lot more on all of it. And that's not where I'm at. I would argue the opposite, which is we're doing most of the wrong things. And if you throw more money at the wrong decisions, you are not going to end up in a better place. So my put on it would be, the budget is coming out of the Congress right now to the tune of around $750 billion. I would argue that if, we keep doing many of the things that we are doing, we could spend $800 or $900 billion the wrong way and still lose. I could put together a losing military for a lot more money than we're spending right now. I think the challenge is, how do we think differently? How do we solve this problem differently? Again, I come back to, everyone wants to jump immediately to technology and toys and operations and concepts. A lot of this is about the sort of underlying sort of thought that we have to put into how are we actually going to win in the future? And by win, I mean deter conflict. And God forbid win if we have to get into it. I would argue that we could actually do that with at a minimum what we are spending today and possibly less. But we're not going to get there. And this is again where I come back to the political piece of this. The answer is not, well, let's just gut the defense budget and hope for the best. The answer is we have to start making these changes now so that the kind of capability that we're going to need to have success in the future becomes a reality in the present. We're not talking about photon torpedoes and cloaking devices. We're talking in many cases about technology that we use every single day to the extent that we almost take it for granted. But it is unavailable in and to a large extent to the United States military. So these are the kinds of technologies that it's not going to take 10 years to develop them. It's a question of getting them into service now, scaling them quickly, and starting to replace old things and old approaches that in many cases, again, go back to these very large, very expensive military platforms that in some cases are not going to be the solution in the future. In some cases are not even going to be survivable in the future. So we've got to stop buying as many of those things. The only way we're going to do that is by actually laying the new foundation of what that future military is going to be. And I would argue that future military is still going to cost a lot of money, right? I mean, when we talk about, or when I talk about, low cost drones, I'm not talking about replacing, an F-35 with one low cost drone. I'm talking about, replacing, an F-35 with lots of low cost drones. So net, the amount of money that we would be, kind of investing could end up being relatively the same. I would argue, if we're doing this right, much of what's changing in the commercial world is around autonomy and automation, where we're able to do more with fewer people, or fewer people are able to do more things. The largest cost driver in the Department of Defense is people. People cost a lot of money. That cost compounds exponentially over time. The benefits that come, all of that costs money. And if we keep adding to the amount of people that we have, that cost is just going to eat our defense budget alive from the inside out. So this is, again, where I come back to thinking we've got to be deliberate about the choices we're making now and how that's going to position us in the very near term to be competitive and to be successful. And again, to finish where I started, it's obviously money is critical, but it does not boil down to money. It first and foremost boils down to the right kind of thinking and the right kind of approach to a problem that is very difficult and very different than the one that we've been planning the military around for the better part of a generation.
Yeah, I try to emphasize this to people all the time. I'm like, look, it's not always about money. Sometimes it is. And actually, when it's ideology, honestly, it's worse because then you have to change somebody's ideology, which is much harder than just convincing them something necessarily on the bottom line. So you're working on all of this, a defensive, disruptive company. So give us then the answer, quote unquote. What are the technologies that we need to see? What, like right now, people who are geeks out there on military equipment can talk about, what were we talking about, Marshall? The ship, the Zumwalt class. Like, we've got these cool ships, we've got these cool guns, the F-35, all of this. But what are some of the things that people should be aware of on what the new technology that warfare should be fought on, in your opinion?
Yeah. So, there too, like we could spend the rest of the show on it. Right. And there's a lot of different answers to that question. Right. And I think there's a tendency to want to reduce it to a technology. It's about AI, it's about space, it's about cyber. I guess the way I look at it is it's more a question of how these kinds of new and emerging technologies are integrated to create a different kind of set of capabilities or way of operating, right? I mean, I go back again to the level of ideas. Like, this is not about a lot of the time in the U.S. government, Congress, and the Department of Defense, and then certainly much of industry. The problem gets framed as, how do I do all of the things that I've been doing just better?
Mm-hmm.
How do I have my tank drive farther and be more survivable and shoot slightly farther? But that's not actually the question, right? The question is like, how do I project power? How do I close kill chains? And the answer may be a tank. The answer may not be a tank. But if you presume that the answer is a tank, then you're sort of solving for the wrong problem. And I think that, generally speaking, we do a pretty bad job of that in the government. So again, I take it out of the level of technology. I bring it back more to the question of like, how are we going to approach this problem completely differently? Like, what is that game-changing approach to the problem going to be? And for me, it comes down ultimately to autonomy. When I say autonomy, I mean not the sort of like quote unquote unmanned systems that we've all gotten used to, which when you really kind of peel back the onion are exquisitely manned. You look at sort of remotely piloted aircraft, Predators, Reapers, there are a lot of people that are required to operate these, quote unquote unmanned systems, from flying them to steering the sensors, petting processing the information coming off of them. The real question comes from like, how can we assemble all of these technologies, AI, ML, and low-cost robotics and advanced manufacturing and sort of digital approaches, new communications, and create sort of families of capabilities that don't require lots of human beings to make one machine operationally relevant, but instead allow a single human being to oversee the operations of larger and larger numbers of machines, and do it effectively, do it ethically, do it predictably, all things that are very important in warfare. But nonetheless, kind of fundamentally break the kind of human machine ratio so that while human beings are still at the center of military operations, what they're at the center of is a larger and growing and more intelligent and more autonomous and at least in terms of the individual systems, lower cost network of systems in all domains, airspace, cyberspace, land, et cetera. And again, I think, we kind of focus on, the pointy end of that, what that's going to mean when it comes to, shooting bullets, dropping bombs, et cetera. But my argument in the book and still today is it's the things left of that are actually, I would argue, more important in terms of, and the place where I think these technologies are really going to change the way we think about the military and are going to sort of arrive first, which has to do with how am I collecting information? How am I making sense of information? How am I turning information into actual intelligence and insight and understanding so that human beings can make decisions and make better decisions and faster decisions? And then how can those human beings extend the reach of their agency to more machines, more military systems to actually affect the types of outcomes that they want to achieve? That whole process, that sort of kill chain process, as I refer to it in the book, is I think where you'll really see, kind of a change in how a future military could be built and operated. And it again kind of comes back to this notion of autonomy, which isn't just kind of like turn the machines loose, let them do whatever they want. It is a very structured process of building and testing and training and building trust. That, if you look at how this is being done in the commercial world, is just painstaking and incremental, but nonetheless is moving very rapidly. And I think that's the kind of approach that is really going to lead to not just a better version of the US military that we have, but just a radically different approach to that problem that I think makes us much more competitive in a world, to go back to where we started this conversation, where being found and being affected once found is becoming a harder and harder problem to defend against, whether it's by hiding or by surviving, armoring yourself, et cetera. The different approach to the problem may be, what if each of the things that is being found and being lost is actually losable? It's actually attritable. It doesn't cost me $11 billion. It's technology that's inherently replaceable in much the same way that many of the technologies that we come to take for granted in the commercial world are, they're consumable. They're disposable in a large sense. I mean, an iPhone is not disposable, but after 18 months, I'm going to get a better one. To me, that's the sort of model that we need to be building a military around, as opposed to all of these exquisite things that cost me forever and cost me a ton to build. And then once I have them, I have like 14 of them and I can't afford to ever lose one. That's just not the world that we're going to be living in the future. And we can't build a military on that basis.
Let's close here with a cautionary tale, because the way I'd sum up this conversation is this is very idea-centric. We're talking about your book in the context of the US entering a post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq war. And in the early 90s, as you write in the book, and many others have written, there was a conversation on reforming the military, the revolution. Saagar, you studied this, in school, the revolution in military affairs. People don't know this, but before Don Rumsfeld really went down in history as, a not great defense secretary, rest in peace, obviously, but he was cutting the budget. He's cutting crazy Cold War artillery systems that just weren't relevant, and he was making huge enemies. That's like an interesting, little, what would the world have looked like without 9/11 bit there. But just what is the cautionary takeaway from the previous era to attempt to apply a lot of the frameworks you're describing, not the platforms, not the exact technologies, but just the idea of, hey, Cold War's over, let's reimagine for the 21st century? Didn't go too well. So to finish here, what's the cautionary tale?
I think it's exactly what you just said. The experience of writing the book, as I was doing it, I went back and I read and reread a lot of that literature, a lot of the sort of government reports and documents and things that have ultimately become declassified, from sort of the late Cold War, early post-Cold War, up to 9/11, then post. And what's shocking is how familiar all of the debates are that we're having today, like how much this rhymes and how consistent it is, and how many people for this amount of time have been saying so many versions of the same thing. Like, again, the thing that I always want to kind of impress upon people is like, I actually don't think there's a lot of new ideas in my book. I think what I've done is sort of bring together a lot of what people far smarter and more experienced than I have been saying for a very long time, obviously putting like a more modern focus on it in terms of where we are today and where we're going. But the cautionary tale, as you kind of look back, is not that we didn't have the means of changing. It's that plenty of people saw what needed to be done, called for it, wrote reports about it, tried to do it, and we weren't successful, right? So, like, to me, the question is like, well, like, why is that? It's one thing if like, we were genuinely caught off guard, it was strategic surprise. Like, it wasn't. Like, so many of the things that we're talking about today are things that people have been talking about for a very long period of time. So the question becomes, well, why did we not do so many of the things that so many smart people thought we should do and tried to get done? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I mean, to end on a note of optimism, the main reason I think we didn't do it in the past is that we didn't have to. Period, right? We were just so far ahead that the idea that we had to change was like, yeah, we'll go, like, when we get around to it, it's like, who's really catching up to us? Like, I can afford to sit under the tree and take a nap. Like, the competition is way behind me. And there just wasn't kind of a sense of existential incentive to make these kinds of changes. I think what's different now, the debate is certainly changing, is that I think people realize from the highest levels of civilian and military kind of ranks in the Department of Defense to members of Congress, staff, bureaucrats, people in industry, is that we are facing a fundamentally different challenge. And, I would argue like a challenge of momentous scale in the rise of China, the modernization of China, the sort of technological evolution of China that, really does, I think, at least it should, force us to change in a way that, when we talked about threats and we talked about sort of the exigency of it all in the 1990s and the early 2000s, it kind of rang hollow. I don't think that's the case today. Now, I think that's one piece of it, but the question becomes, is that sufficient to really change all the things that we've been talking about here, institutional behavior, incentive structures, archaic processes, political and industrial stakeholders that actually are not incentivized to change? That becomes the real question in my mind. So the cautionary tale, I think, moving forward is, even if, question mark, we've now kind of, come to the conclusion that we have to change, right? That there is something worse than changing. As hard as it is, like, if we don't change, it's going to work out worse for us. There's still, I think, an open question about whether we can do it. And again, to try to end on a note of optimism here, that's not a question about lack of technology, lack of money, lack of talented people. We have all of those things in spades. What we don't have, or what we may not have, I think, is the political will, the bureaucratic will, the ability and willingness of leaders to drive that kind of change from end to end and be accountable for disruption. Not in the distant future, but now. And I think that, to me, is still the open question. So again, we got a lot of good things going for us. We got a lot of reasons that we can be hopeful and optimistic about our position and our future. It fundamentally comes back to us. Are we going to stop blocking our own kicks, get out of our own way, and sort of rally all of this and marshal all of this talent and capability and sophisticated technology to actually solve the problem that's in front of us?
I really enjoyed this, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. It's been a blast.